Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Welcome, welcome. I am bringing greetings from the College of Arts and Sciences, in particular, Dean Goldie Bird. My name is Beverly Greer. I'm the Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'd like to welcome you to this exciting event tonight, which is a kickoff for a conference tomorrow. But before I do that, I'd like to welcome in particular all students and faculty and administrators who are here, and also our guests from off campus, and in particular our keynote speaker for tonight, Dr. William P. Jones, and the keynote speaker for tomorrow night, Dr. Paul Brinus. So welcome to everyone. This is really an exciting event. The Gibbs Lecture is an annual lecture. I've attended most of the years that I've been here. But this time, the Gibbs Lecture is kicking off the first annual Gibbs Conference. And that is organized around student research, right, Dr. Smallwood? Okay, which is very exciting. This is what the College of Arts and Sciences loves to promote. That is student engagement in research. And students are really engaged in a lot of STEM research, but we want to see more student engagement in the social sciences, humanities, the arts, and so on. So this is really exciting. I know some wonderful papers are going to be presented tomorrow and in future years. So without further ado, I'll just bring those greetings, and I'd like to introduce Ms. Shibri Wilson, who is the president of the History Scholars. So thank you and enjoy.
She's going to grad school next year in San Jose State.
I'm a senior history
Or UC.
major here at North Carolina A&T. I
Which
also
one is
served
this?
as
San Jose?
2013-2014 History Scholars
Yeah.
President. And I want to welcome each and
There
every
is a
one
San
of you
Jose
to the
State.
annual
Yeah.
Gibbs Lecture and the first annual Gibbs Conference. Tonight we are honored to have Dr. Will Jones, who will deliver a keynote speech on the veins of our theme this year. And our History Scholars Executive Board are dressed in white tops and black bottoms, so if you will need any assistance throughout tonight, be sure to look out for a History Scholar member. And also, thank you for coming.
She's a little nervous.
Yeah.
I think she's going to
Continue
library
to
science.
thanks for coming out tonight. I'm going to speak a little bit about the occasion and Dr. Gibbs. This is the 26th annual Gibbs Lecture, and it's held to commemorate the fourth president, Dr. Wilmer Thomas Gibbs, who is also a historian, I might add, so hooray for the history department. In 1966, he wrote a history of the North Carolina A&T College, which recorded the history from its land grant origins all the way to Dr. Lewis Dowdy's administration. And you can find a copy of this book in the Bluford Library's collection. Dr. Gibbs served as the head of the university during the 1960 A&T sit-in movement, and the annual lecture occurs every year around his birthday on April 5th. Scholars with expertise in African American history and the civil rights movement have provided the lectures in past years, along with friends and associates of Dr. Gibbs. Now, Dr. Gibbs lived to be 101 years old. Now, despite this long life, he's probably best remembered as being supportive of the Greensboro Four. And during the sit-in movement, Dr. Gibbs told state officials that, quote, we teach our students how to think, not what to think. And in this vein, we continue the legacy of Dr. Gibbs in the annual lectures, and this year we mark our first annual student conference, which marks the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and acknowledges the legacy and life of Dr. Franklin McCain. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Nana Opoku, a junior criminal justice major with a minor in history, and I'm the current vice president of the North Carolina A&T History Scholars for the 2013-2014 year. From the History Scholars, we would like to welcome and thank everyone for coming out tonight. Are there any faculty and staff in the building? If so, please stand. Can we all give them a hand clap? Once again, thank you all for coming out today. Okay, up next we will have Dr. James Wood, who is an associate professor here at North Carolina A&T, and he will be here to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Yes, my name is James Wood. I'd like to reiterate the welcomes to not just A&T students and faculty, but to any students or faculty we have visiting from our neighboring colleges or universities, or even high schools, as well as all members of the Greensboro community. We're happy that you're here. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker this evening, Dr. William P. Jones of the University of, is a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Prior to joining that department, he was a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee and also at Rutgers University in New Jersey. Dr. Jones earned his BA in Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University in Chicago, and his MA and PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is where he and I met about 20 years ago, if you can believe it. He's the author of 2 books and numerous articles and book chapters and editorials. I'll just mention the 2 books. The most recent book is the one on which his lecture will be based tonight. It's called The March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights. It was published last year, 2013, by W.W. Norton and Company. This book recently, I would add, recently won the United Association for Labor Education's Best Book of the Year, Best Book Prize for 2012 and 13. And by the way, there will be copies of the book available outside the auditorium after the talk. If you'd like to purchase one, and Dr. Jones, I'm sure, will be happy to sign it for you. Okay. His first book, I should also mention, was called The Tribe of Black Ulysses, African American Lumber Workers in the Jim Crow South. That book was published by the University of Illinois Press back in 2005, and it was also an award-winning book. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Dr. Jones's wife, Dr. Christina Ewig, is also a professor at the University of Wisconsin. She has a joint appointment in the departments of political science and women's studies, and is also an accomplished author in her own right. And she also went to Chapel Hill. Turning to tonight's lecture, this talk and the other events that we have planned for tomorrow, which I hope they're listed in the program that you have, and I hope you'll consider joining us tomorrow for those for the conference events in the day, and then the second lecture tomorrow night. But in these events, we hope we'll explore the relationship between history and memory. The theme of these 2 days is remembering the civil rights movement after 50 years. We want to explore the relationship between what we remember individually and collectively, and how we commemorate our past. I think it's interesting that people all over the world are working to uncover and recover their forgotten or sometimes suppressed histories. Often that kind of memory work, if I can use that term, memory work, is part of what are known as truth and reconciliation processes or commissions. There are many global examples of societies all over the world forced by the shared efforts of dedicated activists and intellectuals, and also everyday people, to reckon with the past, to confront their past, sometimes very painful past. So I could name lots of examples. I'll name a few. Chile, which is a country that I study, Guatemala, South Africa, Rwanda, we could go on down the list. In fact, some of the papers on one of the sessions tomorrow will explore some of those cases. So from that global perspective, we now come back home to the United States, to the civil rights movement, where we find the forgotten history of the March on Washington. So please help me welcome our speaker, Dr. William P. Jones.
Thanks. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks for all of you for coming out. It's great to be back in North Carolina, particularly an excuse to go from Wisconsin to North Carolina this time of year is always a good thing. I expect to go home to snow, so give you a sense of what that's all about. It's also great to, I didn't realize that, it's great to reconnect with Jamie and my brother, long lost brother, Jeff Jones. And I didn't realize that there was such a Chapel Hill mafia running things here, but it's good to see that you all have things under control. And it's a really tremendous honor to be giving the Gibbs Lecture this year, and particularly at a time when we're celebrating the life of Dr. Franklin McCain, somebody who I've long admired and was really glad to be able to talk about briefly in my own book, but given a lot of thought to his life. So I'm really honored to be part of this. It's also the student conference. I'm really excited to see students engaging in writing history and thinking about history on their own. And I guess I would add on a particular note. I think I'm somebody, and a lot of faculty members of my generation are people who benefited from a really remarkable transformation in the profession, in the historical profession, over the past really 30 years or so, marked by, I think in particular, the diversification of the type of people who were teaching and writing history, both in terms of more women going into departments, to the point that in many departments, close to parity, and more people of color going into the profession. But I think actually now we're at a really precarious moment in which I think there's a serious danger of that transformation being reversed, and particularly in terms of the number of African Americans writing and teaching history. We've seen an actual decline in the past few years. And so I'd actually make a plea to all of you who are starting out your careers is to really consider going into the profession as scholars and as teachers, because we really need to have, we need to continue that process and that progress. And if we don't, it's really, I think, a threat to our universities and to the historical profession. So, so please give it some serious thought as a career move. I'll say it's a really good, it's a tough career, but it's a really great and rewarding one. I always say I get paid to do things that I'd do anyway. If I had a regular job, then I'd do that, and then I'd go home and I'd read and write history. So it's a benefit that I actually get to do it as my day job. This year we're marking the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, arguably the most important piece of legislation that was passed in the United States in the 20th century. And I think one thing that's ironic about the Civil Rights Act, as I think back on it, is that most of its provisions, these were known as titles in the language of the law, they actually focused on enforcing things that were already well established in American law. For example, some of the most important parts of the Civil Rights Act aimed at ensuring equal treatment under the law, equal access to the right to vote. These were things that were established in the 14th and 15th Amendments almost 100 years before the law was passed. Major important parts of the law aimed at desegregating public education, This, of course, was affirmed in the 14th Amendment and then also more recently by the Supreme Court decision in the case Brown versus Board of Education, which of course was 10 years before the Civil Rights Act was passed. So in many ways, the law itself was an enforcement mechanism. It was saying we need to actually bring into reality these things we already agree upon if we sort of look at the law and the Constitution. There's one major exception to that, and I want to focus primarily on that exception and its significance today. That was Title VII, which prohibited discrimination in employment. It said that an employer, it made it illegal to discriminate against a potential employee on the basis of their race, their nationality, their color, their religion, or their gender. And this arguably had the broadest impact of any part of the law. This, of course, prohibited a practice that was widespread throughout the United States, not just in the Jim Crow South. So this had a national significance and a national impact. It was not restricted to the government. So most of the provisions in the Civil Rights Act focus on prohibiting particularly local governments from violating people's rights. So these are federal sanctions against local governments. Title VII did apply to local governments. It also applied to the federal government, but it also applied to any private employer and unions, so private institutions and agencies. And in fact, this is what made Title VII, in addition to being the most far-reaching part of the law, and arguably the most sort of the law that has the longest legacy, it also made it the most controversial part of the law. In fact, President John F. Kennedy, when he first proposed the civil rights bill in June of 1963, so this was a year before the law actually passed, he refused to include what would become Title VII. He would not address this issue of employment discrimination because he feared that it would make it impossible to build a bipartisan coalition behind the law. He argued that particularly Northern conservatives might support a law ending segregation in the South. They may support a law upholding the right to vote in the South, but they're not going to support a law that tells a private employer what they can do in an employment decision. So this, in Kennedy's view, made the law beyond the pale. It was too controversial to take up. In fact, Kennedy promoted the Civil Rights Bill, the proposal that became the Civil Rights Act, on the grounds that it was not revolutionary, that it was not changing anything fundamental. In fact, it was upholding fundamental principles about the United States. Things like equality before the law, equal access to public accommodations, public services, equal access to the right to vote. Civil rights, he said, was a moral issue as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution. Right? He said, this isn't controversial. These are things that we can all agree on. So I think that raises, on one hand, a puzzle. How did this happen? How do we get a law that, in fact, is extremely controversial and does not uphold sort of basic principles that are rooted in American history and American law? How do we get a law that actually challenges those traditions and takes the particularly bold step of regulating private businesses? How do we get there? This ended a practice that arguably was as fundamental to American history as the Constitution. That is, the idea that jobs should be distributed not according to somebody's skill, their training, their experience, but according to their race, their color, their creed, or their gender. To get a sense of how fundamental that idea was to American history, we need only look at the development of racialized slavery and the production of cotton and tobacco. The idea that people of African descent are sort of prepared to do this type of work more than people of European descent. We can look at the patterns of racial employment patterns in domestic service. The employment of women in the first factories in the United States. You may not know that the first factories in the United States only employed young white women. Textile manufacturing, shoemaking. Again, the argument was that these were women's jobs, right? This was a fundamental and really unchallenged idea. As late as the 1960s, we can look at classified ads in any newspaper across the country, and they would have read, "Colored woman needed," "White man wanted." These were uncontroversial, largely unchallenged in the mainstream, the idea that there are certain jobs that certain people are better prepared to do. Now, of course, we now live in a country in which those things are illegal, and I think the vast majority see them as immoral. So how do we get that? How do we get from there to here? How do we get to a situation in which certainly employment discrimination persists. People on a daily basis are turned away from jobs because of these arbitrary, what now are seen as arbitrary measures. But very few people would defend those practices in public in the way that before the 1964 it was routine to say, well, of course a woman should have this job. Of course this job should be restricted to white men. So how do we get to a law that in June of 1963, President Kennedy says, this is a simple law, it's rooted in our traditions, to a year later, a law that really upends a fundamental principle in American law and tradition? Now, on one hand, the answer is that access to jobs, and particularly decent paid jobs, had always been central to the goals of the civil rights movement. This is a movement that we often associate with the mass protests against voting rights, voting discrimination, against segregation in the 1950s and 1960s. But it's important to keep in mind that those protests were the result of a long tradition of protest, stretching back at least to the 1940s, in fact, much longer than that. In fact, I think it's possible to argue that what we now know as the civil rights movement, what we call the civil rights movement, actually had its roots in a march on Washington that was called in 1941. This march actually never happened. It was planned and then called off at the last minute. It was called by A. Philip Randolph, the great labor leader and socialist. He was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This was a union of mostly black men. There were also black women. There were also workers of other races, some Filipino and Latino workers within the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. These were all workers. Really, the one thing that united them all was that they were shut out of the powerful railway unions. These were some of the most powerful unions in the country, and excluded from what were the best jobs and some of the highest paid jobs in the country, working on the railway. A. Philip Randolph organized this union, and this established him as a well-known leader in most African American communities across the country. It was actually, he was not very well known outside of those communities until 1941, when he called for a mass march on Washington to protest employment discrimination during the Second World War. Now, there's a number of things that you should know for why he did this. Right before he called this march, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had called on the United States to be what he called the arsenal of democracy. And what he meant by that was that he actually thought the United States should not enter the Second World War. The Second World War had begun in Europe and in Asia. Fascist powers were expanding in both continents. He said the United States should stay out of this fight, but we should provide the weapons and the equipment that will supply the democratic governments in Europe and in Asia and help turn back the fascist tide. So his argument was that by producing weapons and equipment, the United States could supply democracy to fight this war. And A. Philip Randolph and other black workers or black leaders said that's a great thing, They pointed out the fact that the increased production, government production or investment in weapons and equipment had essentially ended the Great Depression for most white Americans. This meant that pretty much anybody who wanted a job could get one. Wages were rising. Unions, particularly, were gaining power in those factories that were producing this equipment. And it had the effect of essentially ending the Great Depression for those people who had access to those jobs. Those jobs were almost entirely shut off to African Americans. Most of the companies that produced those weapons had explicit policies against employing black workers. So A. Philip Randolph said, this is a good idea, the arsenal of democracy. We should embrace this idea. But if we're going to be an arsenal of democracy, how can we do this in such an undemocratic situation and in an undemocratic condition? He first went to President Roosevelt and asked to talk to him about this. Roosevelt refused to talk to him. And eventually he said, well, we're going to get 10,000 black workers to march on the White House and see if he'll talk to us. Over the course of 6 months of organizing, he increased his estimate till by the summer of 1941, he estimated 100,000 African Americans would join him in this massive march. They'd start at the Capitol, march down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, and then they'd end with a massive rally at the Lincoln Memorial. You may recognize some of these ideas. This was the basis for the March on Washington that actually occurred in 1963. As I said, this march was called off at the last minute when President Roosevelt, fearing 100,000 black people in the nation's capital in the middle of a war, decided to talk to Randolph. And he issued an executive order that banned employment discrimination by federal contractors. So any company that had a contract with the federal government had to agree to hire people regardless of their race, their color, their religion, or their nationality. This was a tremendous victory. At the time, people compared it to the Emancipation Proclamation. And in fact, it probably was the first time that a president had done anything in favor of African Americans since Reconstruction in the 19th century. But it was a tragically flawed victory. There were two important limitations. One, it only applied to federal contractors. So it didn't apply to the government itself. The federal government continued to discriminate in employment. It didn't apply to a private company that did not have a federal contract. It even didn't apply to companies that had already signed federal contracts. So if they already had a contract, they could continue to discriminate. Perhaps most importantly, it also didn't apply to the Army, which was actually a growing and one of the largest employers in the country. And during the war, this was particularly galling for African Americans. So this victory, and then importantly, the shortcomings of this victory, set up what would be a 20-year battle. And in many ways, that 20-year battle is what we now call the Civil Rights Movement. It began with this demand, a partial victory, but then a setback that would in fact end with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and particularly with the inclusion of Title VII in that Civil Rights Act. So if we look back at that battle, that 20-year period, and we understand it from that perspective, Title VII is a natural inclusion in the Civil Rights Act. It's not something that gets tagged on at the last minute, which is the way in which many people have seen it. It was actually the primary demand of this movement. Now, I think there's a number of reasons why we need to know this history and why this long history matters. One, it explains the success of the civil rights movement. We also I think we often see the civil rights movement as a sort of spontaneous uprising produced particularly by the frustration of living in the Jim Crow South in the 1950s. As we can see, I think, from this, it's actually the product of a very long struggle going back to the 40s and earlier, rooted in personal networks and institutions that were built up over a very long period of time. And this, I think, is particularly important for us to remember now. I think people often say, well, why don't we have these mass movements? Where is the bus boycott of today? Where is the sit-in movement of today? And I think we need to remember that those movements did not just appear out of nowhere. They grew up over a very long time and were consciously nurtured and built by people over a long period of time. The institutions that were central to this movement often remained sort of invisible or in the background. They were unions like the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. They were also interracial unions like the United Auto Workers Union, the United Packing House Workers Union, the International Ladies Garment Workers Unions. These were institutions that were critical to providing the money and the institutional networks to actually mobilize people in these mass mobilizations, including the March on Washington. There were civil rights organizations, perhaps most prominently the NAACP, which grew when, at the beginning of the Second World War, the NAACP had 50,000 members. At the end of the war, it had 500,000 members. It grew 10 times during the war, largely as a result of these mobilizations around discrimination during the war. And it emerged from the Second World War in a position of being able to mobilize in almost every community in the country on a very sustained level. It also had the ability to sustain the legal suits and lawsuits and legislative lobbying that were so important to the realization of the goals of the movement. There was CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, which introduced the tactics of Gandhian nonviolence, of nonviolent civil disobedience. These were strategies that were developed in the independence movement in India during the Second World War. So people here they read about the news, and they saw what was going on in India, and they said, maybe we can try that here. It actually didn't work during the Second World War. As Mr. Brennis knows, it started to work in the early 1960s and proved extremely effective. There were newer groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which emerged out of the bus boycott in Montgomery, which was actively nurtured by A. Philip Randolph and other veterans of the March on Washington. The principal strategist for this was Bayard Rustin, who was also a founder of CORE and who really implemented these strategies of Gandhian nonviolence that made the Montgomery movement so successful. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which of course was inspired by the sit-in movement that began here in Greensboro. So these movements, these institutions that were built up and nurtured over a period of decades really made that mass movement of the 1960s possible in a way that wasn't always apparent if you just watched what was happening at the moment. But if you know this longer history, again, it becomes more explainable. A final group that was critical but almost completely ignored and continues to be ignored were organizations of black women, the YWCA, the black sororities, most of which were affiliated with the National Council of Negro Women. This was actually the organization that was the most consistently supportive of the March on Washington movement in the 1940s and continued to be the organization that could mobilize people. By the 1950s, the National Council of Negro Women was actually the largest black organization in the country. It had an estimated 800,000 members in cities across the United States. And it became, as you might imagine, with its size, a really integral feature of the civil rights movement. So this was what created and sustained the movement in the 1940s and 50s and created the mass eruptions of the 1960s, which of course reached their pinnacle with the March on Washington in August of 1963, when over 200,000 Americans descended on Washington. In many ways, a sort of reenactment of the vision that A. Philip Randolph had back in 1941, gathering at the Capitol, going to the White House, and then ending with a rally at the Lincoln Memorial. But in addition to explaining the success of this movement, this long history also helps us understand the goals of the movement. What were they actually doing there when they went to Washington? What did they want? Of course, you may know this was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The official demands of the march included passage of the Civil Rights Act, or the Civil Rights Bill that President Kennedy had introduced. Then it was just 2 months before the march. Kennedy had gone on national television and called for a civil rights bill that would speed integration, that would encourage the enforcement of voting rights and access to public accommodations and public services. But importantly, the official demands of the march also demanded a fair employment bill, taking up that demand for a permanent federal law that A. Philip Randolph had issued back in 1941. For many of the people who were participating in the march, the situation was actually in many ways more dire than it had been in 1941. In 1941, remember, the economy was expanding very rapidly. There was sort of widespread prosperity, and African Americans were asking to be included in that prosperity. In 1961, the economy had actually started to contract. What A. Philip Randolph and other leaders pointed to was a phenomenon that they called at the time automation, the automation of industry. This meant machines were replacing workers on the assembly line, and jobs that African Americans had been fighting for years, for decades to get into, were disappearing. In many ways, what they were seeing was actually the beginning of what we now call globalization, the offshoring of American industry, and a phenomenon that even when the economy is growing, even when production is rising, which in fact, believe it or not, American manufacturing production actually continues to rise. It's actually doing very well. The problem is it's not creating jobs. And this is particularly damaging to African Americans, who then and now remain the last hired and the first fired when it comes to layoffs. By 1963, black leaders pointed out this was a problem that African Americans had been facing for decades, but this was a problem, if it was not going to resolve, was really going to hurt all American workers, whether they're black or white. And out of that came additional demands of the March on Washington. They called for a federal jobs creation program that would create jobs that would ensure that all unemployed workers, black or white, had access to dignified jobs at decent wages. They called for raising the minimum wage to $2 an hour. Does anybody know what, if we translate $2 an hour into today's dollars, if we account for inflation, anybody know what that might be? Sounds like nothing now. 50 cents? Any other guess?
No, I heard Reverend L. Sharpton said that, if minimum wage had kept up with inflation, it would be $24 and some change per hour now.
Okay, 50 cents, $24. Yeah, you know what he's doing is he's accounting for the increase in productivity. So the fact that productivity has actually increased. If people were paid what they were producing, it would actually be about $24. If you just account for inflation, $2 an hour in 1963 would be $15 an hour today, right? So, and this is what they said. They said, they had a debate over whether they should even name a number. They said, well, we're not sure exactly what the number should be. So what they did was they said, we need to have a minimum wage that will ensure a decent standard of living for all Americans. They also wanted to extend the minimum wage to cover all workers. In fact, domestic workers, farm workers, and public employees were not included in the original minimum wage, and many of those groups actually remain outside of the minimum wage today. So they were arguing that anybody who works should have access to a decent standard of living. This had a tremendous impact on federal policy. And it went far beyond this sort of affirmative message that President Kennedy had stated in 1963, in June of 1963. It really began a tremendous transformation of federal policy, both in terms of racial equality and economic justice. The March on Washington provided or created a political coalition that actually allowed for the passage of this law that President Kennedy had feared was so controversial. This happened largely after President Kennedy's own assassination. And in fact, one of sort of an ironic twist to the story is that President Johnson, Kennedy's vice president, who became president after the assassination, he said, we need to honor the president by passing his bill, which was a very important sort of rhetorical strategy for passing the bill. But ironically, they ended up passing a bill that the President Kennedy never would have supported, particularly because it included Title VII. And in fact, civil rights leaders pushed Johnson even further with the argument that the Civil Rights Act had to be coupled with a set of policies that Johnson called the War on Poverty. These were increased federal investment in health care, in education, in housing. This created the Medicare and Medicaid programs. And perhaps the most important, particularly for poor African Americans, the impact that this law had was not just in creating these services, but also employing people to create these services. So it led to a dramatic increase, particularly in American cities, in public employment. So people went into the healthcare industry, people went into education, into housing, and this had the effect, particularly for the lowest wage workers, of creating an important employment policy, sort of as a secondary impact. And there's actually a lot of talk, because it's also the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. A lot of people are claiming that the War on Poverty was a failure. And I would challenge you, look at the change in poverty levels in the United States between 1965 and 1975, and see if there's any way to believe that the War on Poverty was a failure. And we can see how it was very directly related to the demands that came out of the March on Washington. So I've gone on for a long time, and I want to wrap up. But so in closing, I think there's a final reason that I think we really need to know. We need to have this long perspective on this movement. And that is for understanding what does it mean for us today. And I think it's important, as Jamie started us on the message of memory. And I think in all of the cases that he named, it's clear that when we remember these things, it's not simply for the sake of sort of getting the story right, but the fact that the way in which we remember these things has a really profound impact on the way in which we move forward. So one example of that, I think, is whether we think the War on Poverty was a failure or not. If it was a failure, then we can get rid of everything we gained from it, right? So get rid of Medicare or Medicaid, because it didn't do any good, right? So obviously, if it did have an impact, we need to know about it. One aspect of that is that I think it's really critical to remember that the civil rights movement was not simply about, it was in important ways, it was about affirming very long established principles in American law and ideals, but that wasn't what it was only about. It was not simply about integration and equal treatment before the law, but it was about much more challenging demands for economic justice and for a decent standard of living for all Americans. For most of us, I think for most Americans, for most people around the world, the one thing that we do know about the March on Washington is Martin Luther King's fabulous "I Have a Dream" speech. And the central message of that speech, which was actually out of character for many of Martin Luther King's speech, was that we need to just live up to the promise of this country. Right? He said, we have been dealt a check that came back marked insufficient funds. And that check was the promise of equality and freedom for all that goes back to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If there's one thing that I would like you to learn about and know about the March on Washington, it's A. Philip Randolph's speech to the March on Washington, which was actually the first speech that was given that day. And his message was decidedly different. He said, "Now we know that real freedom will require many changes to the nation's political and social philosophies and institutions." And he repeatedly, through his speech, called the movement that he led the Civil Rights Revolution. Right? He argued that this was challenging the country to do something it had never done before. And in fact, I think he succeeded in doing that. And I think in some ways, in many respects, we're still challenged by that revolution today in debates over voting rights, in debates over racial disparities in education, in incarceration. But those issues are also very closely related to a broader struggle for jobs and better wages and a decent standard of living for all Americans. And one thing that I think we really need to hold on to, a message that we need to hold on to from that period, is that nobody was going to get that decent standard of living until everybody had access to that decent standard of living. And in some ways, the message was that African Americans were sort of, they were the first to suffer something that was actually going to bring everybody down. I think in many ways we've taken steps backward on both of those fronts recently. Whether it's been in recent Supreme Court decisions on the Voting Rights Act, on Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and how it's enforced. In many respects, these backward steps have been deepened by the Great Recession, and we're starting to recover from them, but they also reflect long-standing trends that we've seen: rising levels of economic inequality, declining wages, coupled with a lack of accessibility to healthcare, to housing, and education. So I think that if we look back on this 50 years later, if we're going to make something useful out of this history and this tremendous legacy of social progress and change, we need to do much more than just celebrate what we've accomplished. We need to understand how we did it, and we need to understand how the issues that were affected then, that people were trying to address 50 years ago, were actually in many ways not the end of a period of history. I think we often see the civil rights movement as bringing an end to the period, the age of Jim Crow, the period of the early 20th century. I'd rather actually us think of it as the beginning of a period that I think we're all living in, which is a period of tremendous inequality, of rising inequality, and one in which, again, I think we need to look back at those fundamental institutions and philosophies of our country, and I think continue to challenge them. Thank you very much. So should I take questions? Or is that, yeah? Are there questions or comments? Yeah.
What is your race?
What is my race? You know, it's funny. I live in Wisconsin, and that's a question that I get more and more in Wisconsin than I ever remember. I mean, I've spent actually a significant portion of my life in North Carolina and in New Orleans. Conchita, you may agree with this. I never got that question in New Orleans, but I don't know if people didn't care or yeah. But well, what is my race? I guess I'm biracial. My father is European American. My mother says that she's the American mixture. She's European, African, Native American, you know. So yeah. What's your race?
I'm a brown individual.
You're brown. I think that's a good. I'll take that. I'm brown. Yeah. Yeah.
as you describe, particularly the issues, the economic issues of the March on Washington, I was alive then, and I'm recalling back how at the March on Washington, I was waiting for somebody to use the word socialism because it seemed so pertinent. And I'm curious, and I know Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, they were not unfamiliar with socialist ideas. And
Right.
was there any, can you say anything about, was there any kind of black intellectual socialist subculture in this picture that was operative, or not really?
No, very much. I mean, the first, A. Philip Randolph, he was very active in the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party actually played a really important role in building the march. In fact, the first public event that happened after the march, it was the Sunday after, or I'm sorry, the day after the march, was a press conference at which Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King, a number of the big leaders of the march spoke at this press conference that was organized. It was a conference of the Socialist Party. I think actually one of the reasons nobody said socialism was this was the height of the Cold War. And that word, had a certain weight to it, right? That was probably not worth bringing up. One thing I would say, though, is if you go and you look at the speeches, the socialist messages are everywhere. The clearest one is actually A. Philip Randolph's speech. He said, right after the quote that I read about we need to reject the fundamental assumptions of our country, we need to change the basic institutions and philosophies in the country, he said, the first of those, we need to challenge the idea that Mrs. Murphy's property rights give her the right to diminish me because of the color of my skin. And what he was referring to was a debate in the US Congress over equal access to housing. And opponents to open housing laws were saying, well, if we pass an open housing law, then this fictional Mrs. Murphy, if she has a room in her house and she's looking for a boarder, and a black man comes to her door, she's going to have to rent her, this room out to this black man. And so it was explicitly playing the race card, right? And a lot of people said, this is playing the race card. But A. Philip Randolph said, yes, she doesn't have the right because she owns it to humiliate me because of the color of my skin. And then what was fascinating is he went into, all of A. Philip Randolph's speeches are little history lessons. That's one reason why I like him so much. He was a historian. He said, we need to challenge the idea that Mrs. Murphy's property rights gives her the right to humiliate me because of the color of my skin. We need to assert that the dignity, that the value of private property takes second place to the dignity of the human personality. Right? That's an explicitly socialist message. And then he went even further. He said, this is a message that is valuable to all Americans, but African Americans hold this really closely because we have been transformed from human personalities into private property. Right? So he said the history of slavery gives us a perspective on how wrong this idea that private property is better than people, right? Which is a really powerful and explicitly, I think, socialist message, but one that was really deeply rooted in the history of slavery and African American history and in American history, right? I mean, it's not a sort of a Marxist message. It's an inherently American view of socialism that I think was really powerful. Yeah.
A wonderful lecture. I like the part in particular about the long history. So I have a question also about the long history, but perhaps it's the long history of backlash, or white backlash. Mm-hmm. So very soon after the Civil Rights Act and so on, we had the Southern Strategy, which brought Nixon into the White House and so forth and so on, and transformed the white South, in terms of its voting patterns and so on. So I'm wondering if we could fast forward to the present. Familiar with Michelle Alexander's Pro.
Yeah.
So the kind of all of the laws that are in effect now with regard to the felony issue and how that's disenfranchised a lot of African Americans, voting to housing, to education, to employment. So do you see the new Jim Crow as kind of part of the long history of backlash, or is it kind of things just came together?
You mean, was it a mistake? No, I don't think it was a coincidence. I mean, in fact, a really harrowing incident occurred the night or the day after the March on Washington. It's in some ways, I think it was unrelated. I grew up outside of Philadelphia, and so this was in Philadelphia. A young black couple bought a house out in right outside of Philadelphia in a suburb. And they moved into their house the day after the March on Washington. And when they tried to do that, their neighbors greeted them with stones and bottles and literally drove them away. They went back. They had been renting an apartment in the city. As one newspaper reported, they went back to their segregated apartment in the city of brotherly love. They actually came back the next day under armed guard. They were escorted in. People had gone into their house, smashed all the windows. They literally ripped the plumbing and the wiring out of the house. So they found their plumbing out on their front lawn. They had spray painted all over the front of their house. This couple actually went and spent the night in the basement under armed guard. They lived there for a few months, and then the husband, had a nervous breakdown. And they eventually just left and gave up. So here we have, this is Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And this is the day after the March on Washington. And one thing that I think that demonstrates is the degree to which that I say repeatedly in the book that, we see the March on Washington. I think we see, Martin Luther King gave this speech and everybody realized they were wrong. And they said, this guy is great, and this is a great speech and we should just love each other, right? I mean, that's sort of a very simplified view of sort of the popular view. In fact, I think it actually hardened views. So it made people who were supporters of the civil rights movement more committed to that, right? And that's in large part why they were able to pass the civil rights law, both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But this is the moment when Barry Goldwater emerges as the victor to win the Republican nomination to run against Lyndon Johnson. His principal message is that if he gets elected president, he's going to repeal the Civil Rights Act. And his argument is that he's not a racist. He actually is a supporter of the NAACP in Arizona. He says that this is about states' rights. Right? So that message, the idea that the federal government should not have the power to tell people what to do with their private property, should not have the power to tell an employer what to do. That is the principal message of a backlash. I mean, that we still see, right? I mean, the case before the Supreme Court right now that's saying an employer should not have to follow the federal health care law, right? It's exactly that same issue. And that was the issue that A. Philip Randolph was addressing, saying, look, people have the right to do what they want on their private property, but not if it means humiliating me. Not if that right takes precedence over my value as a human being. And so I think in many ways it's the same issue. I think that the sides have become more entrenched since then. Yeah, there's a hand up all the way in the...
We're going to take one more question.
Oh, okay, I won't pick it then.
For the book signing closing remarks. Well, I saw a hand up here, so go ahead.
Hi, I'm Elaine. What exactly, Philip Randolph, why did he call off his march if the, I'm trying to get this out. The march, why did he call it off if the Title VII wasn't passed until the Civil Rights Act?
Yeah, and this was extremely controversial at the time. People called him out. They said he was selling out. There's a number of theories about why he did this. What he said at the time was, look, we got a really big victory, and we should take that victory. This doesn't mean we're going to stop marching. This doesn't mean we're going to stop protesting, but we should take what we got and then and use it to and build on it, right? It's not actually clear how many people would have actually gone to that march on Washington. In fact, after they called off the march, they had a victory rally. They said, well, let's have a victory rally anyway. We'll go to the Lincoln Memorial. They actually had to move it to a little stadium on the side, and about 1,000 people showed up. And so it wasn't clear that, some people say he was just bluffing, right? That he didn't have any idea how many people were going to come out, but he was using that as a threat to push. So it may be that he recognized that, maybe it wouldn't be such a big march after all, and he should take what he could get. It's not clear why he did that, but I think what he said at the time was that strategically it was important to take this victory. It was an important victory, and then build on it. And he said, one thing that's really fascinating, a few years after this, he actually gave a commencement address at Morehouse College, where Martin Luther King was actually a sophomore when he gave this speech. I don't have any evidence that King actually heard this speech, but he was a young man at Morehouse. And in that speech, Randolph said he wanted all the Morehouse men, the sort of the elite of the African Americans in the South, to step up, to take leadership. And he said, you need to prepare yourselves for a 20-year battle, because that's how long it's going to take. And we need you to start preparing for that. And in fact, that was sort of a prediction. And I kind of like the idea that Martin Luther King heard that, but I don't know if he did. But okay.
Again, I'd like to thank Dr. Jones.
Thanks.
And before you sit, I have something for you. I want to again thank you for your talk today.
Thank you.
And I have to get it out of the wrapper here. But we want to thank you, and hope you'll accept this as a token of our appreciation of your coming.
Wow.
So,
thank you.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, that's really nice.
Thank you.
That's meaningful. Thank you.
And there'll be opportunity for more questions with him out in the lobby as he's signing books, so we'll have an opportunity to do that.